Okay, good morning or good afternoon, as you prefer. We are here for the Fairness in the Digital Age conference, what we call our autumn conference. Let me say that this conference is a first step in an idea to have two major conferences on the, let's say, conference is a bit larger, but somehow the starting point was the goals of the DMA. So this time fairness, and the next in June next year, contentability. But obviously when you begin to start discussing fairness, immediately the concept opens to many other things. And probably this will happen also in the next. So that's the way in which we have organized this, but let's come into it. Let me first, however, besides thanking you for being here or online, let me first have a few words of introduction, then I'll leave Marco Botta to explain a bit better the plan of the conference. Yes. Okay, the conference, I promise that this is, today is not the last time, but today is the last time I explain this. But the center of the digital society is born out of two old schools, the Florence School Regulation, Communications and Media, and the Florence Competition Program that merged. And the Center for the Digital Society maintains most of the expertise and the activities of the two previous schools, in particular concentrates on competition, on regulation, on innovation. We add democracy as a new theme that is important in the digital society, and then we continue to do our activities of research, executive training, and policy events. So this is a new center that tries to be more holistic in our facing the digital transformation, but at the meantime there are sectors and events and industries and situations that we continue to observe also outside the digital world, but that obviously interact with the digital transformation. What the center is doing, first let me quickly show that the center has a core team here in Florence and maybe in other places of researcher and administrative staff that helps the center to develop its activity. These are our core team people, and some of them will speak in this conference. And also we have a group of scientific advisors that are also, some of them are in this, will speak at the conference and so on. You find all the detail in the our website. Let me spend a word about our executive training and planning that could always be interesting for participants. We have the annual training for next year confirmed on 2 modules, and then training, what we call our annual training, is fully online now, and will be a first module of 6 weeks on regulating digital infrastructure and networks. This is a new module. We are trying to pull together all the regulation of infrastructure and networks. So it's an old module that develops from the telecommunication regulation, but now looks into cloud, looks into data, into many other things that are connected to the networks, to the digital infrastructure. So it's much more general. The program will be out soon, and you could be interested. And then we'll have our, I would say, traditional, even if it's a couple of years that we are doing this, that is regulating digital platforms. Clearly, this year, the next module, regulating digital platform, will get the full impact of the transformation of regulation in Europe with the DSA, DMA, and all the other acts that are moving. And this will be in next June and July. Then we continue our activity on judges. Obviously, is our major competition effort on training judges on competition law and economics. This will be February here, and then a final workshop in September next year. Then we continue also still on judges and still in collaboration with DG Connect, the seminar for national judges on telecom regulation that will be done mid-June in Brussels next year. Then we have also some hybrid trainings that are, for instance, this new training that we are going to experiment on recent development in digital regulation, training for regulators and with regulators. We are organizing a major conference about regulation and regulators out of the impact of the digital European regulation on the national regulators, and they could adapt and react to this new regulation. And connected to this scientific seminar, we have a call of papers out for having this discussion. We are proposing also a residential training about this in cooperation with OECD. Then next year, and it's the final thing I wanted to mention, we will have again the autumn competition school that we just finished today here. That will be again on recent development of competition policy. That is something we do every year, trying to deal with recent developments in competition. Policy events. We have a series of policy events that we are planning. The closer one is a discussion on the SEP regulation proposal that is still out from the Commission, and this will be online 29th of November, and the topic will be the result of the public consultation and the institutional perspective. Then in April, we have, as I mentioned, this regulators and regulation workshop, scientific seminar, and then training. Then we'll do again our Postal and Delivery Economics Conference. It is this major world conference on postal and delivery, sector of the economy that surprisingly still they are fighting. And this year will be particularly interesting because we'll do it in Bern at the UPU, that is one of the oldest United Nations organization of the industry, actually the second oldest. I think that has is 150 years anniversary. So we'll do the conference this year in the UPU headquarters in Bern. Then, as I already mentioned, we'll have the second leg of this discussion that will be the summer conference. The date are already set, 17 and 18 of June. And this will be jointly organized with OECD on contestability, as I say, as a general team, but the program will develop later on. The 14th of December, we also have already planned another webinar on Zoom on the Digital Market Act toward meaningful consumer choice in the digital age. So we'll look, and we consider this mid-December seminar as an intermediate step between this conference and the next one. So if you're interested in the angle of consumer choice and the DMA, that's a good event. I think that that's what I wanted to say, just advertisement and just commercial, but I leave to Marco instead to tell you a little bit about today's conference, how was planned and organized. Marco.
Thank you, Pierluigi, and thanks to all of you for being here today, both online and in presence. So today and tomorrow, we'll talk about fairness, which is a buzzword which is very common today in very different EU policy domains, but even outside of Europe. So we'll try to discuss the meaning of fairness in the context of the digital sectors. What does it mean? Fairness, generally speaking, we can say that is a sort of attempt to rebalance the relation between different stakeholders active in the digital sector. Clearly, how to rebalance, that's something different, let's say. And how we plan this conference is to discuss the meaning of fairness in the context of different policy domains. So we'll start in the afternoon with discussion on fairness in the context of investment cost in the new telecom infrastructure. It's a hot topic nowadays in Brussels. We'll continue with fairness in the context of the European Commission proposal for regulation of standard essential patents, and fairness in the context of generative AI. Then tomorrow, the focus of the day will mostly be about the digital market acts and other forms of sector regulation of digital platforms outside of Europe. Again, looking at fairness as one of the goals of these acts, as let's say Pierluigi mentioned before. So even though the topics are quite different, we'll try to have a sort of horizontal discussion in the sense that we would like to discuss three main questions throughout the panels. First, do we have a comprehensive definition of fairness across these different policy domains? Second, is fairness simply a political slogan, or it's something else? It's something which will have an impact of long-term enforcement, both of regulation and also antitrust. And then, last but not least, what is the difference, if any, between fairness and consumer welfare? So, as I already mentioned, we will have three panels today in the afternoon, and other three panels tomorrow. Tomorrow we start at 9 o'clock in the morning. And then we will conclude the conference tomorrow with a policy roundtable. And the idea of the roundtable is exactly to discuss more horizontally the main points raised throughout the different panels, so comparing a bit the different policy domains. Practical information. So this is an hybrid conference. So the entire conference is broadcasted via Zoom. The registration, the video registration will be available on our websites in, let's say, I would say a couple of weeks, hopefully be after the conference. For those of you who are connected online, you can always ask, and you are very welcome to ask questions to the panelists via the chat box. Nicolo is here, he will monitor the chat on Zoom, but you cannot ask questions via your microphone and camera, so those are deactivated. And also in some panels we have poll questions, so we will basically ask the participants connected on Zoom to vote. And again, I really encourage those of you connected on Zoom to vote, to participate to this discussion, and then we will comment here the results of the voting. If you, let's say, are active on Twitter, or how it's called today, X, and LinkedIn, we will have an hashtag which is UI Digital 2023. So I close here. I thank you for your attention, and I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Anna, who will moderate the first panel about fair sharing in the investment of telecom infrastructure. Anna, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted that the session on fairness in investment in the telecom infrastructure is actually the opening session of this conference, because it's very hard to understate and undermine the importance of telecom networks. They are the bloodline of our economic and digital society, and they are essential for bridging the digital divide and ensuring that everyone can remain connected. First of all, Nicolo, First of all, I would like to welcome four distinguished speakers that we have with us today. So we have Maria Alessandra Rossi, who is here. She's a part-time professor at the European University Institute and also associate professor economics department of University of Chieti-Pescara. We also have Bruno Basalisco, who is the director of Copenhagen at Copenhagen Economics, with expertise on competition regulation and impact assessment in various sectors. Online with us, we have Georgios Mavros, who is responsible for public policy at Google's Center of Excellence in Brussels. And last but not least, we have Mr. Wolfgang Kopf from Deutsche Telekom, who is a senior vice president for public policy and regulatory affairs. So thank you very much for being here and participating in the debate. Before I will give the floor to my panelists, I would like to make a few introductory comments to make sure that we are all on the same page. So in January 2022, European Parliament, the Council and the Commission has issued a joint declaration on digital rights and principles for the digital decade. And that declaration has shown that there is a clear political commitment to ensuring access to excellent connectivity for everyone while protecting a neutral and open internet. And that all the players, all the stakeholders who are to benefit from this should contribute in a fair and proportionate manner. Following this joint declaration, there was a decision from the European Parliament of the Council that has further reinforced the political commitment to ensuring that everyone who benefits from the infrastructure and public services should contribute to that. This political commitment that is included in the documents refers to digital targets that the European Union is seeking to achieve that concern skills, secure and sustainable digital infrastructure, digital transformation of businesses, as well as digitalization of public services. Particularly important for today is, of course, connectivity. After this political commitment, the European Commission has opened exploratory consultation on the future of the electronic communication sector and its infrastructure, which has run from February till May 2023. And the questionnaire, which included 62 questions, was divided into 4 parts that you can see here. Relevant for today's discussion are in particular section 3 on barriers to the single market and fair contribution by all digital players, section number 4. On October 10th, the Commission has issued a summary report on the results of the consultation, and you can find already all the responses that have been submitted also online. There have been 437 responses and 164 position papers. The extent to which the responses are, let's say, holistic vary because there was no obligation to answer to all the questions. Also, given that some of the questions really concerned a data gathering exercise and were aimed particularly at the companies. The whole discussion, if we were to simplify it, is linked to the fact that when it comes to the traffic on the internet, which has been growing exponentially and which is expected to continue growing, is coming mostly from just few firms, big tech. And the question that stands behind the debate is whether this data growth imposes costs on telecom operators that are unfair and unsustainable, or otherwise whether the traffic growth can be met by investment made only by telecom incumbents. And the issue is that if we have growing traffic and we need more investment, and we also have digital targets that the European Commission has set, how can we meet them? What is the problem? Is there a market failure? If there is an investment gap, how can we overcome that? Potential causes behind suboptimal investment are different. On most of them there is agreement, on some of them there is disagreement, but on the screen you can see some of them. So fragmentation of the EU markets, the fact that there may be barriers to in-country and cross-border consolidation, intense competition in the European market, so the fact that there are so many telecom operators, in particular in the mobile market, the fact that average revenue per user has been decreasing, in particular in the mobile markets, despite the fact that the quality in broadband has been consistently increasing over the years. The lack of sufficient investment is also linked to overly restrictive regulation, lack of harmonization with respect to spectrum, maybe strong net neutrality rules. It's something that Alessandra will discuss. High but also very heterogeneous spectrum fees, so lack of sufficient harmonization in that regard. Uncertain business case for 5G, but also the fact that we have consumers who are used to low prices in the retail market, and therefore the market may suffer from their low willingness to pay for the increasing and improving broadband speeds and quality. So this overall situation in the telecommunication market basically shows that we have a disruption driven by technology evolution, both in the wholesale and the retail markets, which have put under stress telecom operators. With respect to the main findings from the report on the exploratory consultation, I would like to focus on those that concern section 3 and section 4. So when it comes to cross-border consolidation, it seems that there is sectoral regulation is the main reason for cross-border consolidation, and there is an agreement between telecom operators and big tech on that aspect. Because if you actually read the report, you would see that on many issues there is actually lack of consensus, but this is one where there is a consensus. Other obstacles concern different legal standards, fragmented investment protection mechanisms, lack of interoperable networks due to radio spectrum usage variations. With respect to cross-border consolidation, an important aspect is also lack of a business case, because apparently it is not going to result in the same efficiencies and synergies as intra-market, in otherwise in-country consolidation would allow. With respect to fair contribution by all digital market players, different practices already exist in EU member states with respect to contribution paid to electronic communication network providers. And the policy initiative that aims to introduce a fair share payment by content providers to network operators is considered by content providers as fundamentally flawed and not future-proof. Of course, there is a question whether we can still aim for future-proof regulation given how fast technology is changing in the markets. Network operators, on the other hand, argue that there is a continuous investment need and they are not in a position to meet those needs on their own. Hence, there is, as I have mentioned earlier, the traffic is increasing, but the investment is suboptimal. And the reasons for that can be different. Telecom operators are saying that they are in facing an imbalanced bargaining position vis-a-vis content providers. Some argue that strong net neutrality rules are responsible for the whole fair share debate. Whether we will see any fair share mechanisms or not, concerns are being raised about the impact that it will have on consumers who may face higher prices, on competition, both from smaller providers and from network providers, as well as in general incentives for innovation. Another agreement that has been, not agreement, but many stakeholders who replied to this consultation agreed, is that they do not like the idea of having an EU or national digital contribution, so taxation at the EU level for that. The debate is so, it is, I have to say, quite polarized, of course. And to date, we have seen many reports that have been commissioned. We have seen, initially, there have been basically issued by consultancies, but after that, we have started seeing also academic articles being published on the topic. So there is a big disagreement on whether there is a market failure, what are the main issues, whether any reasonable mechanisms can be introduced, what type of problems it would raise. But I think that irrespectively of this disagreement, we can agree actually with what Mr. Breton has said in his statement on LinkedIn, where he announced that there will be a Digital Networks Act. And I think that given that there's so much disagreement, I would like to mention that because I think this is the message for today. So I can't see it because of that, but we should work together. We should work together, industry, public authorities, to uncover and remove the obstacle to much needed investment and make them more efficient. Some have tried to reduce the issue of investment to a battle over the fair share between big telco and big tech. It's a binary choice between the vested interest of those who provide networks today and those who currently feed them with the traffic. But while finding a financing model for the huge investment needed, an important issue that we will need to deal with, so much more is at stake. It is about achieving the giant leap ahead of us, not only in the telecom sector, but more broadly in the digital technologies. And I think the discussion is, in fact, it is not a binary discussion. Telecom networks, as I said, is a lifeline, a fundamental infrastructure for the whole digital economy and digital society. And especially with the increasing geopolitical tensions, I think if we want all to participate on an equal footing in digital economy, it's really important that we work together and that we do not see things as black and white, but that we try to get to the gritty details and understand how to solve that problem in a way that is workable for everyone. And with that, I would like to ask my first question to Alessandra. We have seen in various posts and academic articles and reports that apparently one of the reasons we have this debate is that net neutrality rules are too stringent and restrict commercial freedom between telecom operators and content providers to freely negotiate agreements. Do you think that it's that simple? And do you think maybe in the meantime, Nicole, if you can launch the poll. So do you think that these two things can be dissociated or they are strongly linked?
Thank you very much, Anna, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. So it's hard to start this conversation because this is a very sensitive conversation. It's full of very delicate details. And it is dear to my heart because as Anna was saying, having nice infrastructures to an economist sound like a good idea. So it's something we would like to work on. But Anna is asking me a question that is more precise, and I'd like to start from the very basics in addressing this question, which provides us already a slight taste of what fairness means in this particular context. So what is the problem at stake here? So at its core, there has been a lot of discussion. So there has been a political attitude or the policy attitude has been sensible. It has been, let's try to separate network neutrality from the fair share debate. It is sensible in the sense that I don't see it as politically feasible today to bring back a discussion on network neutrality. The open internet regulation is very much solid right now in the minds of many participants to this debate. But at the same time, it is a bit logically inconsistent not to take into consideration net neutrality when talking about this fair share debate. I'll try to explain why this is so. So let's go a little bit to the basics. So what is this fair share debate all about? It is basically a debate that has to do with unfairness in how the value from the internet value chain is divided. An unfairness that prevents investments in networks. Why is it so? What's the linkage with network neutrality? It is so because there are many reasons why negotiations between CAPs, content and application providers, and ISPs are asymmetric or do not take place at all. So there is a linkage between the investment in networks and bargaining between CAPs and ISPs, according to which the division of the surplus is not fair. I just attract your attention on this particular point to point out that this means that we are giving fairness a specific meaning. We are giving fairness both a meaning that has to do with how, with distribution, so with how the value is divided, the usual notion of fairness to an economist, and also a meaning that has to do with efficiency, that is, with the existence of some sort of market failure. So we are using fairness in this debate to mean both things. And what is the relationship with network neutrality? The idea is that we want to fix this problem of fairness, which is a problem of distribution that also has consequences for investment and thus for efficiency. We want to fix this in a way that mandates negotiations between CAPs and ISPs, or under the shadow of arbitration. So we are focusing on negotiations, on bargaining, as the way to solve some sort of market failure. And here is where network neutrality comes in. It comes in because network neutrality is a discipline that, although not directly, but it influences bargaining between CAPs and ISPs. I say not directly because in the open internet regulation, there is nothing that prevents explicitly contracts between CAPs and ISPs, but there are two rules that, if not prevent, but influence what economists call threat points, so the bargaining positions of the parties. And these rules are the prohibition of traffic management based on commercial negotiations and the obligation to make sure that all consumers or all users have access to any content. Together, they make it very difficult to negotiate for commercial agreements. So there is a relationship. I would say more, there is more than a relationship. I would say that from my perspective, an economic perspective, the issue we are looking at here, it's really the very same issue. So what we are talking about, it's really whether we want to observe more negotiations taking place between CAPs and ISPs. And this is different from what we have often heard in this debate, in which very often we've seen people saying, oh, this is a very different issue. No, I'm as an economist, I think this is really very beyond the legal details, but at its core, the issue has to do with how much bargaining we want to observe, if we want to force it or not. So the answer to your question, Anna, is yes, if we were convinced that we want to observe more bargaining, I think the first place to look at would be network neutrality rules, because they do constitute an obstacle to negotiation. So there is a relationship between the two debates, that's for sure. But for as much as I care about infrastructures, I think the next step, once we acknowledge that the problem at its core is very, the problem of fair share and of network neutrality is very similar, I think we should reflect very carefully on the costs and benefits of forcing negotiations. And here things get more complicated. Why? Because if we, well, the cost side, it's actually, I think, rather simple. So there has been a huge debate on network neutrality, and we know from that debate that direct negotiations between CAPs and ISPs do tend to create some distortions and some forms of discrimination, both between large CAPs and small CAPs, and between large ISPs and small ISPs, if they receive more payment from large, if the first receive more payments from large CAPs. So on the cost side, we know something. As regards the fairness, the fair share debate, we also know that we would add to these costs also significant transaction costs. So the issue really is if the benefit side would be sufficiently strong to outweigh these costs, provided we can reach a political agreement on the fact that these costs are bearable, which is something different. But I limit myself to consider the benefits from such a move. And I think we should be a little careful in defining the benefits. First, the first observation that I want to share with you is that when we are talking about the investment gap, we are not always talking about underinvestment. What I mean by that is that the investment gap is the distance in terms of investment with respect to what we have politically decided is desirable. But this actually does not have much to do with what an economist would call underinvestment. For sure, this is an area we've known forever. This is an area where underinvestment does occur. It's an area where there is plenty of externalities everywhere. So that is where we do observe a lot of underinvestment. But the precise size of that underinvestment depends on a careful balancing of marginal social benefits and marginal social costs. That is a separate thing with respect to the calculations of the investment gap that we've been seeing so far. Second point, it strikes me how hard it is to find a precise quantification of the investment gap. Anna has mentioned a figure of 2050 billion euro. In the consultation document, there was a figure of 174. People have answered that the additional gap to build also standalone 5G, etc., to the most desirable situation would be other 300 billion. But then there is a question in which it is asked to every single firm how much they would need to invest in their optimal investment situation. And that is about 200 million per firm, which multiplying for the number of firms in Europe would lead to a figure of about 100 billion, right? So it is very hard to really pin down what's the amount that is needed. And this is a bad thing when you are trying to design evidence-based policies. Other two things that I think are important to consider in this discussion is that traffic is increasing, which means that the usual way in which you normally profit and you normally remunerate investment seems to be heading in a less bleak direction, at least that's my perception. And a final thought is on the availability of public funds, which out of these 600 plus billion euro that have been put into the Recovery and Resilience Fund, only 3%, about 18 billion, have been dedicated to connectivity. So maybe there is something in this number to take into consideration. So if we remember what we are discussing about the benefits that are linked to some sort of market failure. If we look at the market failure that is dubbed underinvestment, we cannot really pin down how big that is. So that is hard it is hard to really make a case for benefits that outweigh costs. Second point, and I hope I'm not taking too much time, second element, which is strictly linked to the issue of bargaining. So as we were seeing, there is another possible market failure that is involved, which is the market failure linked to free riding. The idea is that big techs, caps, are using resources without paying enough. And there is some appeal to this view, of course, and there is a sense in which there is some sense of unfairness in this big asymmetrical distribution of both bargaining power and proceeds from the value chain. Yet, if I put on my economist hat and I try to cut through the immediate reaction, I see that what we are talking about, networks and services, are complementary goods. So things get a bit messy in the sense that it is very hard to define free riding this type of situation. Why? Because when there is a complementarity, investment in one of the sides creates benefits for the other. So it is hard to define, to make it clear that there is some sort of free riding, even though like our gut feeling would say, yes, there is an imbalance, there is an asymmetry. And what happens is that caps do create both, through their traffic, the imbalanced traffic that Anna was talking about, create both increased costs, that's for sure, but also, no, that's for sure, it's not for sure, sorry, it's just the impetus of talking. No, they do create increased costs. It has to be quantified how much these costs are, but also do create increased revenues, because by creating content that is liked by people, they create increased willingness to pay. And second point that, again, tries to look at what kind of benefits we can produce through forcing negotiations. If we allow negotiations targeted on traffic, so motivated by the fact that we have to address in some way these traffic peaks, what type of investment are we going to promote? I think we are going to promote mostly investment in peak demand management, which is a different thing. It might be desirable, I have no precise idea, but it is a different thing with respect to the type of investment that we're discussing about when we are discussing about the targets that have to do mostly with coverage. To cut a long story short, so I do see network neutrality and fair share as connected from an economic point of view. I do not think that at the moment we have sufficient evidence to conclude that that part of the network neutrality regulation should be amended. Yet, I do think that the network neutrality rules should be made more flexible, and this could be a way to increase, to make sure business models of telcos can be more up to date. But I don't have time to talk about this now. Maybe I can come back to this later. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. If we have time, absolutely, you can get back to that. I just wanted to know that to the first poll question that we have, which is, in exploring the future needs of the EU connectivity sector, would it be helpful to reconsider also EU rules on net neutrality? 72% said yes, which I find quite surprising, because there seems to be no political interest in revising those rules. But as we have just heard from Alessandra, it would seem to make it would have sense to actually talk about this. But as you rightly mentioned, there is lack of evidence. And I just wanted to make two comments on what you have said before. I will move to the next speaker. When you mentioned about the free riding and complementarity, I thought that the relationship with fairness may be precisely there, that maybe there is not a fair proportionality in how this is monetized. So we have complementary assets, of course, but I think that the fairness concerns opportunities to monetize from that. And now I would like to move to Georgios Mavros, who should be online. Yes?
I am. Yeah. Can you?
Perfect. So I would like to ask you what is, but you can still have the poll questions on, because maybe Georgios would actually like to comment on the second question, where we have asked, which aspect of big tech's involvement in telecom networks worries you the most? Monopoly and market control, data privacy and security, infrastructure development, and no concern. So mostly people are concerned about monopoly and market control, and in the second place, they have no concerns, and the third one is data privacy and security. So do you have any position on that? And do you want to comment on the results of the explanatory consultation that have been just published in October?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm very happy to be here today. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to Florence, which obviously is a big miss as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I'll have a few comments in a meeting in a minute on the issue which is at stake today about the poll. I would like to say that it seems to me that the poll suggests something that we see in the public discourse and the public debate, that when tech companies have been extremely successful, and obviously this brings scrutiny, and these are the questions around dominance and how this success is used in the services that we roll out and we offer, and how these services impact our business partners and society overall. And I don't necessarily, at least as far as I'm concerned, I don't necessarily consider this specific concern, which is legitimate, by the way, to be linked to the question of fair share in the telecom sector and the relationship between tech and telecom sector. Now, if I may move to the issue at stake, and I'd like to thank the previous speaker. It was a very enlightening intervention. Fairness obviously is a noble objective, and we all aspire to achieve. And obviously, as the previous speaker has demonstrated, the challenge lies in translating this kind of high-level consensus into actionable solutions. And I think that in order to doing so, we must address some preliminary questions that will help us define the contours of fairness and explore eventually relevant solutions that could lead to fairer outcomes. Now, the first question, obviously, that we need to address is, what is the issue at stake that would require a potential rebalancing of fairness? And you wouldn't be surprised to hear from me that we don't believe that it appears from the data and the evidence that has been so far been published and released, that there is a clear problem articulated which would need an immediate resolution. And we don't necessarily believe that there is a compelling reason for policymakers to intervene. If we look at what's happening as we speak, Europe has been making good progress towards achieving the digital decade targets, particularly in terms of connectivity infrastructure. Network deployment is well on track to meet the European Commission's 2030 targets, with 70% of European population connected with fiber and 66% with 5G as of the end of 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And at the same time, digital skills and cloud services usage are also on the rise. Now, there are some legitimate questions on what about use cases that haven't been sufficiently present so far and might pick up in the future. For instance, the development of the metaverse is a popular topic of discussion, but it doesn't seem, at least as far as we're concerned, we do not believe that it is anticipated to cause capacity constraints. Partnerships play a crucial role in delivering the next wave of connected applications and metaverse development, but this will not require telecom operators to increase, in our view, capital expenditure for network investment. In the foreseeable future, its adoption will continue to be driven predominantly through VR, virtual reality, which is currently consumed over fixed networks through Wi-Fi. And Wi-Fi, as we know, is already established across most of Europe and carries nearly 20% of the traffic of mobile networks. At the same time, we have seen in this public debate that took place over the course of the last year or so that even multiple regulators, including BEREC and the UK Ofcom, they didn't find any evidence of market failure or lack of infrastructure investment or consumer harm that would justify the possible introduction of what we call a network fee. So that was, at least from our perspective, the first question of what is the subject matter and to what extent there is an issue that would require a form of rebalancing of fairness. The second question, of course, that we must address is, in this context, which are the stakeholders that are worse off and can legitimately call for a fairer relationship or a fairer partnership. And in the context of our discussion today, it appears to me that there are three relevant parties. Obviously, the telecom operators, a wide range of content and companies with different business models, and last but not least, the end users. From our end, when it comes to the, let's say, tech companies, I think it is essential to recognize our significant investment in the space so far. I mean, tech companies are also investing in infrastructure to make sure that we kind of deliver our services as well. And Google alone has invested a staggering $200 billion in the digital ecosystem over the past of 3 years. Beyond, I think it was a fair point that was made earlier, that it's extremely difficult to pin down a specific figure on a potential underinvestment. I mean, obviously, we know what we pay, but it is a big debate. But beyond the question on penciling down and pinning down figures, there are some technical advances that actually took place over the course of the last years. For example, from 2018 to 2021, we managed to reduce the amount of data used per minute of video watched on phones on 4G by double-digit percentage. And this happened per year, and this concerns YouTube, which, as we saw in the previous presentation, is potentially, one of the platforms that is very popular, and people are actually consuming videos there. So this is about the tech companies and their investment in this space. For the content industry, imposing additional fees could have unintended consequences, as this might divert funds and hence stifle content production. And this, in turn, would hinder the industry from making a compelling use case that is essential, in my opinion, for the success of the 5G network. And lastly, but not least, the third, let's say, group of stakeholders which are concerned by this debate are consumers. And we have seen that consumer associations group have claimed that these proposals may have negative repercussions for consumers, and therefore these consequences should not be taken lightly. Now, in conclusion, I think it's vital to remember that telecom operators and the tech industry are partners and will continue to be so, irrespective of the fact that this specific narrow debate has been slightly polarizing so far. And obviously, this collaboration has been integral to the development of our digital world and will continue to be in the future. In my opinion, I think the focus should be on how we can support the underlying economics of the telecom market to improve economies of scale and scope across the European single market. Stronger economies of scale can help telecom operators enhance their profitability, while economies of scope can enable them to offer new services that attract more users and consequently generate more revenues. In our pursuit of fairness, we must carefully balance the interests of all stakeholders to foster an environment where innovation can thrive and consumers can enjoy the benefits of this dynamic partnership between telecom operators and the tech industry. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very clear view. Nicola, if I can ask you to bring, yes, Bruno presentation. And I would like to ask Bruno, do you think that the future evolution of traffic will have any impact on the viability of any potential legislative instrument, in particular with the deployment of 5G? Anything will change in that regard? And also we focus on whether there is a market failure, what type of instrument would make sense. Alessandra has talked about cost and benefits of forcing negotiations, but there's also a question of how the type of instrument would be implemented. So if you could discuss these two issues, Bruno, thank you.
Anna, thank you. Thank you to the UI. Thank you to all the speakers for being here and all of you for listening. I will start with a straight answer to your question. What does the future hold? I have no idea. Let's keep the expectation low, but let's try to think it through. And I will focus my contribution today on this very difficult and very important question we're discussing here, which could take the entire conference. I will focus on implementation points. This is convenient focus on the how more than on the why. And I will cover 4 points, and looking forward to wider feedback from fellow speakers and the audience. 1 point is the traffic evolution and pattern. Another point is the structure of industry. A 3rd point, the role of existing regulation, and the 4th one on regulatory design and governance matters. Let's take them one by one in a short way. This slide is an illustration, so it's a stylized description of the challenge that I see. I've been discussing with several of our colleagues who practice in the area of TMT and digital. And essentially, there is a sense now, and I think this is the picture also that the best informed regulators and their experts can take of what current telecom networks look like. And here I mean telecom in a broader sense, including also the important role of the infrastructures built by players that are classified as tech, and which ultimately make the internet possible and the role of broadband services possible as we know them today. A key question when thinking about the implementation of this type of policy will be not just the situation today, but essentially in the future, how many new entry-exit points for large-scale data flows will there be? And how significant will be their weight? What will the new topology look like? I'm using maybe more economist language than engineering language, therefore I'm certainly imprecise on that matters, but will those new points grow faster in their way, in their weight compared to the existing core points? Existing core points include both the telecom core nodes for fixed, for mobile, now converged, as well as the, for example, hyperscale data centers and all the related networks that link them to the telecom core nodes. We know that there are important applications. This is the data we put out there from a high-level review of the literature, key technologies that are already with us and that are up and coming more and more. AI, M2M and IoT, edge computing will each add to the traffic and change the pattern of the network. One way to look at it, again, it's simplified, is that a lot of the AI applications will be closer to the core, thinking about the computing which will be needed to power even further the role of AI. Again, this is simplistic, while edge by definition and also M2M and IoT can be different places in the network. So this is where there may be a lot of new entry and exit points that we don't see now. Let's take to a road traffic metaphor. So the pattern of traffic and car and lorry usage is changing in our economies. It's changing as fast. If this was data, if data were cars and lorries, it's changing as fast as maybe cars and lorries were changing in the 60s and 70s in many industrialized economies. And yet we are in the discussion today thinking about maybe one part of the network. So we're considering new rules for motorway charging, while maybe the traffic could affect also existing local roads, new local roads and intercity roads. Is this a reason not to regulate or not to intervene? I would not say so, but I think it's important to consider that there is a broader pattern evolution. The next point, and if you want, we can also stop with the slide, is related to the structure of industry, which in my view matters. And so this is the vexed question of the cross-border scope and therefore consolidation in telecom networks. An example from another industry, again, here in the postal and parcel sector, there is a set of rules which has been revisited recently by the UN agency UPU, which Pierluigi was mentioning, which essentially affects interconnection in cross-border post and packages. There are some, what happened is that ultimately outcomes in the EU have been clearly affected of the change in these global rules on interconnection, have been affected by the structure, by the existence of a large number of national operators in this sector, which is different to what we have in other jurisdictions. So also in the sector of telecoms, the current structure does affect how this type of rules, this type of regulation will affect the market. And so it's an important factor to keep in mind. A third point is the role of existing regulation. Anna mentioned that in her introductory presentation that low retail prices are a key driver of the current situation. So this opens the door for an easy goal that I can score, and essentially we could say that it is all the European University Institute's fault, that they are too good at teaching regulators and the judiciary how to intervene in network industry, regulation and competition. And there is therefore a very strong and intense regulatory pressure and pro-consumer favorable outcomes in many markets in the EU, in practically all. Another way to look at this is to acknowledge that in the EU, where we are, unlike in most other jurisdictions, the effects that we can attribute today to the net neutrality regulation interact with the effects of a history, by now a long history of SMP, significant market power, telecom access regulation and wholesale pricing rules, and all the competition safeguards and even more pro-competitive policies in wholesale and retail broadband markets, together with the antitrust case law. So this is who we are in the EU. And so when in the EU we were looking for a solution to this complex regulatory problem, we probably cannot just look for an answer to this regulatory question elsewhere in other jurisdictions, whether in Australia or elsewhere, because our mix of the breadth and depth of telecom regulatory intervention and the antitrust case law that has emerged in Europe, plus the industry structure, is relatively unique. So this calls for attention in how to implement and what regulation to design. A fourth and last point is about the design and governance of this prospective EU regulatory policy intervention in this area. The powers of EU regulation and regulators matter, because if we're serious about the role of cost-based costing evidence in applying any rules in this area, then this could arguably be a case for a single point of cost analysis and regulation. However, we know how vexed that question is of a centralized European regulator, and this debate has already been held in the EU twice. So that's one round more than the net neutrality debate. It's a tricky question. Another way to look at this is to think about the contribution of a legal expert, Professor Anu Bradford, European-based in the US, therefore a broad view, which has coined a term called the Brussels effect. You may be familiar with the book and the paper and the legal paper. In a nutshell, what I found interesting as an economist working in this area is that the contribution of that scholar is that part of the success of EU regulatory policies and their global impact is being to regulate what is defined as an inelastic target. One way to say this is that in the case of much regulation that European Union institutions have been successful to introduce and spread globally, the target is regulation that affects the consumers in the EU single market, which cannot go anywhere else. So in a sense, they are kind of hostages of the EU regulatory policy in a good way. It is easier to regulate rules that affect consumers than to regulate capital, for example, in the current international financial trade rules. Therefore, the question for this specific question we're discussing today is how elastic or inelastic is the service of reaching the same EU consumers via different peering, transit paths or routes. How will the rules affect it? What other patterns and solutions would there be? We know something about this, but this is also quite anecdotal and based on natural experiments, network failures of specific points or routes, often at the margin, often limited. We do not know how would the impact of a large-scale regulatory intervention pan out. Do we know? Can we predict and manage this? The answer is likely to be made only by a quite superpowered regulator. So are we sure that this is what the telecom industry wants? In conclusion, we cannot expect that this type of regulation, this type of regulatory proposals can be made in a sort of driverless regulation mode. AI cannot run the regulation for us yet. This is good news for our careers, for those of us involved in this. Who will drive this, and what governance for these rules will be needed? I stop here and look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Bruno. So your comment about the industry structure, I think, is linked, saying that it's quite unique in Europe, is linked to Mr. Mavros' comment about the fact that one of the ways of supporting the whole debate is to actually find ways to build stronger economies of scale and scope, no? But we do not have time to discuss that in depth right now. What I would like to ask Mr. Kopf right now is this. Some say that this debate is not new, that we have heard it already 10 years ago. But what has changed? We have heard from Mr. Mavros, for instance, that big tech are investing also in the infrastructure. So what are the main differences between the fair share debate as we know it today and as we knew it 10 years ago, where Nelly Cross said either adapt or die to telecom operators? And also, if I may, the second question would be, we've heard that there are restrictions to bargaining between telcos and big tech, but we know that there is an ongoing case between Deutsche Telekom and Meta in court in Germany. So if you can provide more details about this case, then it would be, I think, of interest to the audience. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Anna, and for having me. So far, it has been a really interesting debate, and I have to say a lot of new aspects which have not been discussed in Brussels in depth have been already discussed at this table. So I think it was a very good idea to start this discussion, also in the light of the publication of the proposals of the EU Commission. Before I'm going to the to give an answer to your question, let me tell you a bit about the creation of this entire debate, because it has an origin. One of the origin, and that's more anecdotal, was a conversation between my boss and the then CEO of Google, who said back in 2015, you build the networks, we make the profits. That was never forgotten. Their emotions. I think the more serious reason for discussing this again, and there I'm coming to your question, was the experience at the beginning of COVID. We've seen the breakdown of networks we've never thought of breaking down in Switzerland, in Spain, and in some other countries due to content overload. And we already heard that it is a peak problem. It's not a peak problem in terms of investing. If you're investing in telco networks, you're investing step by step. And there's an engineer rule that, for example, we use. If 50% of capacity is reached, you have to invest. There are some countries who take it more easy. They invest at 70. Our subsidiary in the US had that rule until they had 78 in Manhattan, and the whole network broke down 5 years ago. So you're better at these 50% rule. And that means and we are talking here access networks. We are talking here mobile and fixed access networks reaching the consumer. I'm not talking about the wide area networks, where we had to invest as Deutsche Telekom within 1 year, first year of COVID, 1 billion, just to cope with the traffic, just to give you an idea. So what has changed? I think people do not really notice how dramatically the internet structures, the underlying internet structures worldwide have changed. Let's go back to the early 2000 years. The internet was created on the notion of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 providers. What we all have in mind is the internet is the network of networks. So there are a lot of networks scattered around the world and they interconnect. That was the business model at the time. And there were a number of networks which were so big that the traffic exchange, and they were called tier 1, was not, there was no payment because the assumption was the traffics are the same amount, more or less. If you were a tier 2 provider, just to give you an idea, Deutsche Telekom was always a tier 1 provider. Tier 2 providers were Swisscom, Telekom Austria, and smaller European providers. They had to pay for some of the traffic interconnection and for the routing. And that was the international carrier market. 10 years ago, we still had that system somehow in place. What happened after was the huge rise of big tech. The competition lawyers and economists among you, I can really recommend following the ongoing Google case, because due to US rules, discovery, you get everything about strategies of these years. And the most important strategy is get all your traffic on your platform. And if you get all your traffic on your platform, you start building a network, a worldwide network, which is quite cheap. I mean, the investments are maybe 10 to 20 billion. And the effect is you can concentrate all your traffic without obeying any rules. There are no network neutrality rules in your private network. So what you are carrying in terms of traffic is completely out of any regulation, is completely out of any control. If you look at the transatlantic traffic today, 91% of all traffic is carried in private networks of Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple. What happened with this discussion? The problem is there's a point where they hand over the traffic. And the traffic they hand over then is the traffic we have to carry. And that's all sorts of, for example, in video, we have only HD traffic. So I'd like to know more about what Georgios said about traffic reduction. What we see is 20 to 30% traffic increase per year, also coming from Google. The point is, if you want to carry that traffic to your local network, that worked so far quite well until the peak times in COVID. But what we know, we have that investment gap. Because the investment gap is seen already in 5G. If you look at the underinvestment in 5G in Europe, you might look at figures coming from OECD, and you compare the past 10 years in terms of investment per capita in networks between the US and Europe. The numbers are for the last year, I have it here, 211 euros in the US, 104 euros in Europe. It used to be higher in Europe. And there we come to this vicious cycle you already in the beginning showed. The problem in Europe is, and you mentioned it as well, with the telco industry is that the prices always went down. So the idea, we get more interesting revenue, we get attractive content from which creates then revenue, is just not happening. Never happened before and will not happen. This is because of the very business of the internet. The content is paid by advertising. What we are seeing is increasing advertising traffic. That contributes again 20 to 30% increase in traffic. And somebody has to carry that, and somebody has to pay for the network which carries that. If you then look at the valuation which comes from these nice advertising revenues, and we all know that the companies we are talking about are super dominant in the advertising market, that gives you an idea why the valuation of the companies is as high as it is. I mean, just to remind everybody, Apple's valuation is more than the GDP of Italy. Sorry to say. So that gives you then an idea about the imbalance once you start negotiating. And you ask about the case. Let me first clarify what our industry has proposed in the beginning. We think what happened and what I just described is a market failure. Because 10 years back, we were still in negotiations, and for the traffic, there was payment. Our international carrier business at the time had about 5 billion of revenues. Nowadays, it has less than 500 million. But the traffic in between increased 20 times. So, difficult to manage in terms of investment. There's the argument, fine, you have to build your fiber networks, and the fiber networks are being built somehow. They are built slower, but they will be built. Why? Because this industry, the telco industry, invests at least 18% of its revenue. That's more than all big tech invest. It's quite a high number. The point here is we didn't envisage full regulation. And you rightly pointed at that, because we are not the fans of cost regulations and the way Europe is regulating network industries. I think the experience in our industry shows that there are better ways to regulate. And I'm coming from a company which operates on two sides of the Atlantic. And just to give you an idea, our market cap is about 100 billion. The market cap of Vodafone, Orange, and the other big European carriers together is less than 100 billion combined. The only reason why we have a huge market cap is US, because there's still an opportunity to earn some money. So what we are looking for is light regulatory model. What we want is that we start negotiating about the pricing of this traffic, because we think the price is the best parameter to steer also efficient traffic. I'm glad to hear that Google tries to do something in that regard, but our experience is it doesn't really happen. So the traffic we get is everything, yeah? And the increase is huge. So if you have a price where somebody has to pay for, we will have a different traffic pattern, and we will have increasing revenues as well. We can invest in networks expansion. So the idea was mandatory negotiation. If we fail, an arbitrator, European or national, and then the idea was also to exclude some unnecessary side effects in content. For example, if we don't want to start with regulating or making payments to public TV channels, to smaller operators, to smaller content provider. So there should be a limit of 5% above this share in traffic. You would be subject to that rule, below it not. And there was the idea that TV channels must operate in 3 member states in order to be subject to these rules. If they are above 5%, there's no TV channel in Europe even close to 2% of traffic. So that was the idea. Let me conclude with the Meta case that shows you the asymmetry. In the midst of COVID, the Meta contract was newly negotiated, and all over overnight, we got an email. We think we don't pay anything anymore. Full stop. And that was the end of the negotiation. The question now is, why do we still carry Meta traffic? The reaction of everybody in our company was, if they now also play games, they could, for example, lower the speed of any Meta service. So there's a huge fear in every telco that the basic big tech services like YouTube, like Meta, do not work, because the customers, of course, value your network about the speed of this service. So we are trapped into a situation where our negotiation partner can say, listen, quality of the service might be better, might be worse. Yeah? The reason is, of course, our consumers depend on these services. So the answer to that case was, we still carry all the traffic. Every German consumer gets every Meta service, but we went to court and tried to sue Meta for the payments. That was also a quite interesting experience, because it took us more than a year to even get the lawsuit placed in Ireland. Yeah, I mean, that gives you an idea how Europe works. They refused to relieve the lawsuit and played all sorts of interesting procedural stuff. You'd usually expect somewhere way behind Europe. We then ended up at the Bonn court. The Bonn court had some first views, which were going into our direction, but it then declared himself not responsible because there's a more competent cartel court in Cologne, and that's where we are now. German courts are pretty slow. It's not only in other countries. So a public hearing will be taking place not before spring next year. That's what I can tell you about the case. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would have so many questions myself, but I would like to give the opportunity to the audience. If any of you, either online, okay, Mr. Mavros would like to respond. I would like to see whether there is anyone here who would have a question, because we are already behind time. So I would like to kind of manage this last.
I'll be very brief, because I think Wolfgang made a very valid point, and probably I haven't expressed myself very clearly. I didn't say that traffic decreased. I just said that we're using technologies on YouTube to compress videos so that it take as less data as possible. when they're efficiently transmitted over the internet. Just wanted to make this clarification.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Go ahead.
Thank you. Audrey Kozar-Fresney from Qualcomm. I do have a question for Wolfgang. I didn't get like the end after the Bond Court, which declared incompetent, if I understood. What's the next step for the lawsuit? Yes.
The next step is just a public hearing, and then we will be, I don't know, for at least a year or more in court, exchanging views, and then there will be a judgment. Yeah.
And sorry, which court now is looking after it?
Cologne.
Cologne. Okay.
There's a specialized cartel chamber at the Cologne court.
Thank you.
No questions online? Okay. I think that what you have mentioned about the view you had for mandatory negotiation seems to me to be compatible with the reply that we got online from the audience on the final question, which is how do you think governments should regulate big tech's contribution to telecom networks? And there were 4 options: strict regulation and mandatory investment, light regulation with incentives for contribution, so with basically negotiations, no government involvement, and I'm undecided. So this option for mandatory negotiation with light regulation was the most popular among the audience. Alessandra, you mentioned earlier on that you wanted to add something if there was time, so maybe I will let you do that, and unless there are other questions, I will conclude then with your comment.
I'll be super brief. I wanted to comment on 2 points that came out from the other speakers. First, you rightly mentioned one important benefit of negotiation, which would be creating incentives for CAPs to filtrate a little bit more their traffic. I think this is an important incentive, but I have 2 caveats on those. It's unclear. So this is part of their business model. So I'm not sure it will be an incentive that really bites, right? And the second thing is, in general, we do want to have more traffic because this is what drives, in any case, the growth of this ecosystem. So I'm a bit, again, all considered, I'm not completely convinced. Second point, just to clarify myself, I do think that there are important issues to be addressed in the European telecom industry. This is an industry that is undergoing both the impact of digitalization and what we would call structural transformation. My point is that if I have to look at what are the drivers of this change and the culprits, I'm not sure that looking at mandatory investments would be the main solution to that. There are many other aspects that surely deserve attention, including what Bruno was mentioning earlier on in terms of consolidation, etc.
Well, I didn't comment on that. I think most of what was mentioned about the state of this industry is fairly true. And of course, the lack of consolidation is one of the biggest issues. And if I'm looking in the past, I mean, also we were hindered to create some of the services, others are now benefiting. There's a whole history of very interesting decisions at DG Comp, which just unbelievably, looking at hindsight. What you mentioned was somehow, I would say, interesting, because you said we have an interest in increased traffic. And that's exactly the point who is paying for it. And the current model is telcos are paying for it, and the revenues are going down, and the investment abilities are going down. And what you are seeing in Europe, and that's why I mentioned the investment levels, I could also add China. And if you then look at the networks, you could also add network throughput. So how are the data rates? Yeah? And there Europe is definitely falling behind in a way which is dangerously behind China, behind US, especially in 5G networks. We're completely underinvested in 5G. And that will be revealed maybe in 2 or 3 years. Everybody will discover. And then the big question is, who, why? Yeah. So I think, of course, you can change net neutrality, but I don't believe in that. Yeah. And at the same time, I believe in net neutrality. I think it's a good principle in terms of neutral content, and content shouldn't be selected. We could have another discussion whether we have net neutrality at all, because the content is already filtered in the 3 or 4 platforms. And there's content moderation to such a large extent that it is really scary for society. But that's another discussion. On the network level, I think somebody has to pay in the end. And if we agree that the consumer in Europe shouldn't pay the bill, in the US, the consumer pays the bill, just to be very blunt. I mean, the average return per user in the US is more than double as high as in Europe. That's why nobody in the US cries fair share. Yeah, they still make the money with the consumer.
Bruno, you wanted to mention something?
Well, I have a question which takes us to the point on of scale, since I think almost all of us as speakers have mentioned this point. So this is a classic economics question, way to look at the problem. It's not the only way, but given also what we've seen in other industries where actually the presence of competition to some extent between different players in Europe affects how players from outside Europe can use access into the European networks. This was the postal case, for example. When we go back here to this telecoms case, if we were to make a hypothetical scenario, I'm not calling for it, where you do not have anymore the large number of players we have in Europe, but you have one player only, at least at the core level, still with retail competition and maybe with several access networks, competing infrastructures, but one core point, one gateway, so to speak. Would the concern of the telecom industry be resolved? Would it be mitigated? Or would there still be the points that apply to change the rules, change the situation? So is structure alone something that can address the situation? That's my question to the panel. If somebody mega merged some of the core networks of all the European telecom operators into a single benevolent regulator operator, but you had multiple, what is now multiple into a single core point, to then have to perform the functions that you're performing now individually as one tier 1 operators and others. Would your concern be removed? Would it be mitigated? So is structure and concentration something that can on its own solve the
okay, now I got it. I think the question misses where the costs are occurring, and the costs are occurring on the local access level. So if you have a bigger European operator and you would allow for consolidation as it happened in the US, you have, of course, economies of scale and scope. But it's still the local network which causes most of the costs. And my prediction would be, if we see the US development, I mean, there the traffic explosion is even higher. And what we are currently seeing in the US is a declining ARPU. They might have the discussion in 2 years' time. Yeah. So the point here is the local networks carrying that traffic to the consumers, they are the reason for the high costs, and they must be built out. Yeah. The answer is so far, I mean, such a big monopoly or duopoly operator maybe has more economic power to negotiate. That's another point, but I think that's unrealistic. Yeah.
I would like to thank, okay, Scott, this is the very final question because we are far beyond time.
Yeah, sorry to jump in so late, but I had a question especially for my old friend, Mr. Kopf. Better? Good. Okay, so a question especially for my old friend, Mr. Kopf. I'm a big fan of negotiations, and I recognize your proposal, negotiations with a fallback to arbitration. But my serious question is, will that generate the right kind of results? It seems to me that there are two reasons why the telecom side would be limited. One is one that Professor Rossi was already talking about, which is effectively that network neutrality to some extent ties your hands more so than that of the caps in the negotiations. The other is that there are many players in the space, most of which, almost all of which are much smaller than you, who may not have sufficient bargaining power. So if we go to the fallback on arbitration, can the arbitrators, to what standard would they be trying to negotiate? In the absence of some quantitative model to drive towards, can they do a meaningful arbitration? It's a serious question, not a rhetorical question.
I think it is difficult to predict the dynamics, but we think that the arbitrator which would be in place there is a regulator who knows a little about the costs of networks and how such a price should be set. That's one thing. The other thing is in negotiation dynamics, we have a parallel, which is of course at the moment under discussion in even in a neighboring room. And that's standard essential patents where you have a similar system. So the experience there showed that the parties are rational enough to come to something which is beneficial to both. But of course, that's the decision we discussed also internally among many people looking at the thing. Would it be better to have regulation, full-fledged regulation, or such a system? I personally really believe in negotiations. I don't want to have a regulator looking then again on the entire network structure and all the costing and blah, blah, blah. That's why we came out with these proposals. There's always a better one. So if you have an idea, happy to hear.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as you can see, this has been just the first panel of the whole conference on the fairness in the digital age. And we talked about fairness in the investment, and you can see how complicated it is. What seems to me to be important is that if we want to kind of summarize with a high-level message about fairness, we should consider everyone's incentives to behave optimally from the point of view of the entire ecosystem, especially if we think about complementarity of the products that are being used to deliver final goods and services to the consumers. For any future legislative proposal, it's important that the Commission has more convincing and robust evidence. And so far, this has been only an exploratory consultation. And I have seen that out of 100, more or less 8 companies, only 25 have submitted information on data, because it was at that point not obligatory. But should the Commission decide to pursue any legislation, then it could engage in an exercise where it would officially ask for data and operators would have to provide it. So I would hope that then there would be more robust evidence, which ultimately bring me to the question of targets, because of course we haven't even put into question whether the targets are correct, whether they make sense, but that's a very complex debate. So as you can see, ensuring fairness in investment, it's a topic that I think will keep all of us occupied in the coming years. So thank you all and enjoy the break, which unfortunately will be 15 minutes longer because we would still like to start on time at 4 o'clock. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Anna.